Nobody heard of autoethnography 10 years ago. Now it's everywhere. There's been a whole sort of breakdown of the distinction between science and art. So arts-based research, and it's very difficult to know exactly what we're talking about here, because it's a lot of things, a lot of voices. They're using poetry, painting, drama, music, and so on, as part of, is it a method, is it a form of representation? It's all in flux. And all that now becomes part of a huge dialogue going on across the social sciences. And it's like an invitation to this creative process. It's just mind-boggling when you start into it. So this general loosening of the whole strictures, which is kind of, it's not constructionism per se, it is like, it speaks of the same processes, questioning the traditions in a way that opens up new possibilities. The advent of Buddhist practices into therapy. Now, therapeutic practices in the modernist period were truth-seeking. There was going to be a form of therapy, going back to psychoanalysis, which was going to be the true and lodged in reason and lodged in evidence. And multiple forms of therapy each grew up with their own school, making claims for basic truth and keeping their people in line with those ideas. And you don't find that so much anymore. You know, I talked to a group of therapists last year. I said, well, how many of you use Buddhist practices in your therapy? None of them are Buddhist, at about 80%. They just add it on. Because there isn't any kind of form of therapy you must do. I mean, even cognitive behavioral therapy, even though it's dominant in terms of requirements in the United States and much of Europe, once you get into it, once you pass the test, it's an open game. It's like people do pretty much whatever they want to. I have a friend in Germany, cognitive behavioral therapist, you go by his office, and all you hear is laughter. What's that guy doing in there? But it works for him. But he just labeled a different label. Anyway, it's just kind of loosening, it's ground roots loosening. Okay. Now let me go back to constructionism, and what I see is the seeds of the alternative to mechanistic metaphor. All right, when I did this third edition of Invitation, I had to ask myself, well, what's new? I want to get the things that have happened since the last edition in here. Very little in terms of, you might say, some of the theoretical background. There are not a lot of new ideas in the history of science, sociology, and knowledge. It's kind of variations on things that are 30 years old. I mean, it's not an explosion. Not much new in terms of narrative theory, literary theory, deconstruction theory, pretty much variations on things, and so on. Critical theory still lives, but it's again, variations on ideas that have already existed. So it's not like that's not a whole brand new landscape. What is new? Practices. What those ideas have helped to support or invite are practices. So in that first book, there was one chapter devoted to practice. In this book, there are 3 chapters devoted to practice, because that's where everything's happening. People developing, again, research practices, practices in organization. I mean, all I had almost in the first edition was AI. Now it's like collaborative practices all over the place. Interesting, fascinating things going on. Practices in therapy, the mushrooming of early on of all the sort of constructionist-based therapies into collaborative therapies now, which are not so school-bound. It's more greater concern with what are the practices, how does it work, how does it go? Now, let me go to the next slide. Because this is, you can also begin to see what this is going to do for modern. Okay, so, yeah. If you look at those practices, there are two things about them which are really important. One is, these are the practices that have grown out of constructionism, of which most of you are part. You quickly realize there are no fundamental units. Everything can be reconstructed. And secondly, that reconstruction is an us. It requires a collaboration of some kind. It requires, it's not my reconstruction, it's us, we do it together. So in some sense, units cease to be so interesting as the process by which we make it happen. Subtle shift now, away from getting the world right, getting it orderly, into, hey, we can make it what we want through collaboration, and stability, that is getting it fixed, so we know how it all works. Much more interested in that process of negotiation, dialogue, what happens next as we move through this, what are the phases, what are the sequences, what happens next in the conversation. Very little of let's fix it, test it. Much more, how do we do the talk? How do we do the relationships? Causality, you hardly hear that among, I would say, among much of what you do. You may get into it a little bit with consequences. That is, how could we measure it? AI is deeply into that. Show me the evidence that AI works. And there's a lot of resistance among the AI community to having to test it. Because you realize, if you're in the constructionist stuff, that the test too is a construction of some sort. And that may not be the way to proceed. But causality, just as a concept, which look, when I grew up was essential, you had to understand the world as causal, just isn't there. Structural explanation, how many of you rely on, I'm not saying none, on psychology to explain what happens in the dialogue, or what happens in the negotiation, what happens in the mediation, what happens in the collaborative research, what happens in the action research? It just becomes muted. Where is the talk of sociology? Where is the talk of social structure? Now, I'm not saying it's dead, but it's just muted. Because there's a much more emphasis on how it is that here and now, in this space, we're going to make something happen. And knowledge as a map ceases to be interesting as we're testing hypotheses so we can get better and better and better, because we know that any practice that we develop, it's going to have a restricted lifespan. That AI works only because of a cultural condition. Narrative therapy works only because of a cultural condition. Anytime you try to make one of these practices into a system, in the old sense, let's make it a method, it'll die pretty rapidly. As soon as people know they're being put into a method, well, whose method is that? And what's it doing to me? I mean, we're already critically alert to this. So it's like you almost have to keep these practices alive by continuous reworking them in some way, or new audiences of some, a new way of doing it. Just keep that whole knowledge-making production in continuous motion. Now, get the themes that I'm generating here. Collaboration, negotiation, no causality, no particular interested in making a future, not predicting it, form and action, all that stuff that's built in, first of all, the constructionist ideas about knowledge. gets into inform or underlie, in some sense, the way in which we understand our practices, now moves out into the culture. Academic culture, practical culture. Academic culture. Whole movement, and you know, I should say it's not just from units. If you keep pressing that outward, you're going to rapidly get to relational. Something relational. It's not the units that count, it's the relationship. First of all, the collaboration among us, but then beginning to understand that the world is all made up of that way. And in that collaboration, you can't easily separate out what's me from you. Because that collaboration is a conversation, and I can't do it alone. We can only do that together in some way. So I am not the unit, you're not the unit. The unit's got to be somehow, if we're going to talk about units at all, in the process of our being together. So what we need is, why units as individual isolated things? Why not relational way of looking at the world? Now, there are a lot of constructionists, particularly theorists, who pick this up, and now there's a whole sort of group who call themselves relational constructionists, because that's what they want to do. They want to construct the world in terms of, understand it in terms of relationship. That's a huge and important project, because if you can do that, you basically change the whole worldview from Aristotle into the 21st century. There aren't any units anymore. There's only relationship. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't have the language for it. The language fights us, and we in constructionism are not the only people who do this. If you look at the term relational, if you look at term, I can't remember, the Google counting facility, where you can look at the word frequency. In the last 30 years, relational goes boom. And it's just not us who are talking about that. It's everywhere. I just found last week 3 books on relational sociology. 2 years ago, the whole psychoanalytic movement on relational. Let's move away from individual minds to the relational process. Look at all that's going on in environmentalism and ecology. It's all relational. You can't understand any plant species or any individual activity of anything outside of the ecology in which it exists. All of Darwinianism is being rewritten as we sit here, not in terms of survival of any species, but in terms of interrelated species, how they support each other, how no species can survive without the others, and how our whole existence is based on microbiotic, cells inside, and other life that we depend on. So we're sort of made up of all these living creatures. I mean, that whole mindset, we can't see it anymore in terms of individual, isolated, alienated, bounded units. Now, you move on from stability then, as long as you've got relational, it's hard now to have stability. Because as I said before, once you've got a unit that you can describe, to be a unit, it's got to have some stability. If you have a relational, it's not clear what kind of stability you ever have, because as you rapidly realize, there's no end to how you can expand that relational process. That is, you can take the dialogue we're having as a relational process, but yet you realize rapidly that that's based on a whole set of other dialogues. It's based on the air we breathe, the food we eat. It's based on the larger ecology, and you can expand on, expand and expand, so that this dialogue is part of a vast, vast sum of whatever's going on, so that anything can impact anything else. So you just are not fascinated by stabilities anymore, but by process. And this also gets picked up now. You've got a whole movement in the organizational field of process theory. Big meeting every year in Greece. Process thinkers, active researchers, and so on. Process management, process theology. All this is going on, you know, outside of constructionism in particular, but these are all movements that are in like synchrony with things that we do. So in that sense, you can begin to see whatever we're doing as part of a much larger movement. Now, let me just locally get back to a little bit of something. Always a question about associates, you know, whether this person is part of, sort of in line with the kind of thinking we do. And as one school says, well, constructionism is like, has these kind of suppositions, and we should only have people who really have all those suppositions in line. Now, I have not liked that view very much at all. I don't want to draw a line around what constructionism is and say these are the necessary principles, and anybody who's you're either in or out. But if the practices are synchronous, if they make sense within that whole sort of underlying perspective, hey, let's talk. Because we may have some words to add to what you're doing, but your practices will add to what we're doing. So many of you here may not know very much about constructionism. It's possible. But what you're doing is very much part of the dialogues and the kinds of things that we're attempting to do. Now, again, this focus on, this is a little tricky, the focus away from theory about what's behind things. And I don't see this everywhere, but let me give you one good example. It's a big movement in organizational theory. It's, organization is practice. Leadership is practice. Group functioning is practice. Now, what that generally is all about is taking away anything behind. It's pushing, like Marxist materialism or psychoanalytic repression, and saying, let's focus on what makes up the here and now of what we're doing that brings it about. It's a whole way of thinking that's going on here. To have this conversation, how is it working in terms of what I do, what you do, and how these things are related, how we bring the chairs into it, how we bring the floor, the lighting, because all this is going to be interconnected. And if you want a good discussion group, if you want a good leadership, it's those interlocking practices that you have to pay attention to. How do they function together? Without trying to go back to explain it by something else. It just sort of drops away. It becomes a much more pragmatic. How can we do it? And what elements do we need? Because this is all going to be related. So this focus on the here and now, that creates whatever is to come. Creates whatever is to come. Doesn't predict it. It creates it, which brings me to predictability. Again, you move from predictability as being the end to get it all straight and make it all work, to the notion that there's a continuous kind of emergent quality, that what we make will lead to something which will lead to something else. You do AI, it's not a permanent fix, it's just a piece of the conversation. You do therapy, it's not a permanent impression, it's part of the conversation. It may do something in the here and now that you don't know. It's like Frank Barrett, an improvisation. Life is more of an improvisation. You have to pick up what's happening and do something with it, and it's going to lead somewhere else, and the consequences you don't know. The whole theory, we don't know, all we can do is act to hope together that something will happen from that. Complexity theory gets into it a little bit, where you realize that the system's always in change, and they're going to be emergent properties. Those are things that are going to emerge out that were not part of the past. And the system is going to be altered as a result of it. Now let's have the last slide. What I'd like to suggest and propose is that you can see implicit in all this movement a kind of an alternative to the mechanistic metaphor. I want to call it protean, which is problematic in some ways, but I'm trying to get a way of understanding where there is continuous, unpredictable change. Something that you can't hold on to. I can't even say it, and that's part of the point. I don't want to be able to say it. I don't want to have it to be a thing, like a machine. But more of a sense of our life is about continuous movement and change. And we're in it. We're locked in it together in our world, so that we move through a kind of to a relational. Yeah, we understand that it is relational. That it always got to be part of the premise of doing anything. Like the background of modernism was machine-like. That we're not interested in stabilizing and fixing it. It is inevitably in process. And by the way, this is to go back to Aristotle, with this emphasis on atomistic units. Now you've got this whole sort of divide in Greek philosophy between Aristotle and Plato on the one hand, and Heraclitus and other philosophers who are all process philosophers. The metaphysics of the process philosophers from Heraclitus, everything is in flow. You never put your foot in the same river twice, nor is it the same foot. I mean, it's a whole way of understanding. Everything is in movement. Totally different perspective on how it is we're living our lives. But that's not, it's like I mean, in terms of Western history, it would be a profound change in orientation. Relation, process, confluence. Now, that's my term, and there are a lot of other ways to look at this, but I'm trying to find a term that you understand things not in terms of causal units hitting each other, but the flowing together of, and flow is, you can't say the thing, but you might say the currents, but currents are never stable. So you look at whatever is now as a flowing together of relational process. So to make this practical for a moment, again, the question would be, for the success of an organization or therapy or a life, it's not the well-being of the unit. And it's not only the well-being of a relationship. So for example, in therapy, it's not that person's mind that's important, it's a person's relationship, but that relationship within a larger process, right, which could include physical environment. Okay. So the flowing together at a particular time in history, because the flows will continue to change. And we understand things in terms of the confluence, and thus trying to work with the whole confluence as opposed to the individual. And again, going from structural explanations where we get very involved with the theory behind it into working with the thing, with the here and now, with the mediation process, with the community building process, with peace building and so on. How do we do it? What is it composed of? The knowledge then ceases to be a map of anything. Its knowledge is always in the making. What comes next? It becomes much more pragmatic. How does it function? What can we do with it? What happens next? And what are the values attached to that? Because this is all about values. What world do we want to see? What do we hope for? How can we communicate with each other about multiple views? Okay. That's a lot of words. What I'd like to do, well, first of all, I want to get some of this discussed in groups, because I want to go back to what this would mean if we're moving towards a protean perspective. If we are, and that's up to question too. And even whether this is a good way to put it. Well, what would it mean? Before we do that, I just want to check out. Anybody want to have a question, add something, but just make for clarity here if I can. Yeah, I can't hear anybody but deaf.
Can you just starting to touch on it, and I hope this is an okay question. You're just